Hello, this is a recording of a Winchester Heritage Open Days event live streamed in 2020. We hope you enjoy it.
My name is Rebecca Rideal. I'm a historian and I was thrilled last year to have participated in the Winchester Heritage Open Day, and I'm so excited to be here again in a different kind of format, but it's lovely. I think one of the few nice things about this situation, and I stress few, is that we're able to bring in audiences from around the country, even around the world. So I'm here from Mercia, and I'm happy to be chatting to you all. Today, well, this evening I should say, I'm really delighted to be speaking to Professor Ryan Lavelle about a subject that I don't know that much about myself personally, but I'm a huge fan, mainly because of The Last Kingdom. But just to give Professor Ryan Lavelle something of an introduction, and I'll try and stop rambling. You are an academic, a historian, a historical consultant to The Last Kingdom television show, and also the author of two recent books, but lots of academic articles and publications as well, Places of Contested Power and The Land of the English Kin. So, Ryan, how are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. I think we'd better mention that I'm from Winchester University, otherwise my university will probably never forgive me for not mentioning that fact as well. But the Places of Contested Power book actually is a book which is edited, and it's co-edited with Alex Langland, and it's in honour of another Winchester historian, Barbara York, who was our supervisor at different times in our careers, and it's available for free for download as well. So I thought I'd just put that plug in there at the beginning, just in case I forgot to do so at the end of the session there.
Well, why not? Why not? Just one really quick thing to say to the audience. If you have questions that you'd like to put to Ryan, obviously you know that we're talking about Alfred the Great and his world this evening. If you could put those questions at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A box, or there's a chat box as well, and I'll try and get through as many of them as I can when we get to the Q&A section, which will last about 10 minutes. But before that, Ryan, we're going to travel into medieval England, aren't we, this evening? Could you, before we get on to Alfred the Great, could you paint a picture of what the world, well, what 9th century Wessex and England more broadly was like?
Yes, yeah. So the 9th century England in the 9th century isn't a kind of single united kingdom by any means, and we tend to think of it in fragmentary terms, in regional terms. So there were basically 4 major kingdoms that were still sort of around. Effectively, the situation in Anglo-Saxon England has been compared, I think, in a tongue-in-cheek way by a historian as like the rounds of the FA Cup, effectively, where you sort of start off with the smaller teams and they're competing against each other, and then by the 9th century we're sort of reaching what could have been the sort of semi-finals and the finals before something big happens. Somebody comes along and steals the ball, but we'll get along with that in a minute. But Wessex is one of 4 kingdoms in England, and the West Saxon kingdom have been doing quite well during the course of the 9th century. Recent historical work has recognised that we may be doing the Mercians a bit of a disservice in sort of talking up the West Saxons a bit, in that the Mercian kingdom wasn't on a kind of downward trajectory. It used to be thought, well, Mercia had done rather well during the 8th century, this sort of Midland kingdom of Mercia, and then the West Saxons were kind of doing rather well, and they were doing very well. But effectively, you've got this sort of situation where there isn't a sort of single united government as well in any shape or form, really. But you've got these sort of regional kingdoms where power is held by rulers who moved around. Basically, they're not able to sort of remain in one place for any long length of time. They're having to sort of shift around, and power is very much something, authority is something very much based on a personal face-to-face basis through meetings of, well, the meetings of the wit and the wise within the kingdom. This sort of, well, I hesitate to call it proto-parliament because people tend to then go, oh yeah, that's the roots of the English Parliament, but this sort of proto-parliament, if you want to sort of understand it in that way.
Okay. So we've got this country that's not united very clearly. It's all split into regional sections, and then within this world we have a young boy that's born, the third son, am I correct in saying, to Ethelwulf?
I'm trying to remember. Yes, Ethelwulf. Yes, I think it might even be the fourth, but hey, we can edit it later in the recording.
So he's down the pecking order anyway. He's not top. And could you describe to me his childhood and how he came to be king? Obviously, being not being the eldest child, how did it happen that he would become king of Wessex?
Yeah, we don't know a great deal about the childhood. There's a couple of moments in Alfred's childhood about which are told in the account. I'm holding a book that isn't my own actually here, which is Simon Keynes and Michael Lappage's collection of sources, Alfred the Great, which includes the life of Alfred written by his biographer Asser. And Asser was trying to basically construct a version of Alfred's life that told him, and that kind of cast him, it spun him in the right light. It spun him as a kind of great European ruler, as a kind of Carolingian ruler, rather like the rulers of Carolingian Francia, the descendants of Charlemagne. And Asser was trying to portray Alfred's life as this kind of great Christian figure. So the moments that we learn about Alfred's life are his going to Rome, possibly even twice, according to Asser, meeting the Pope, in which Alfred, possibly remembering it or retelling it to Asser, is retelling it as a moment where Alfred's kingship is then recognised by the Pope, and it's this, basically he's a sort of 5 or 6 year old boy. He's an infant, effectively, in classical medieval terms, and this is obviously a moment that makes a great impact upon his childhood, because his father had gone on pilgrimage to Rome, and we know that Alfred had gone on pilgrimage because Ethelwulf and Alfred's names are in a Liber Vitae in a North Italian monastery, so they're recorded amongst the list of names of the great and the good to pray for. And Ethelwulf returns from Francia, sort of modern day France, more or less, and returns with a new wife, a young Frankish princess. And so Alfred has a new stepmother, and that moment casts a great influence on Alfred's life, because his stepmother, a great historian by the name of Ginty Nelson, who wrote a biography of Charlemagne actually recently, brilliant sort of big doorstepper volume of Charlemagne, but she's also looked at Alfred and kind of thought about the impact of this sort of moment of this young bride coming to the West Saxon court, this foreign bride coming to the West Saxon court, glamorous young woman making a great impact upon a young boy at an early formative age, in his kind of 7, 8 years old or so. And this moment is retold as Alfred learning by heart how to recite a book of Psalms, because his mother is said to have said to Alfred and his brothers, if you can learn to recite this book of Psalms, then I'll give this book to you, and whoever learns to do this, then they'll get it. And this is said by Asser to be this kind of moment of learning. And Ginty pointed out, well, actually Alfred's mother wouldn't be alive at this point, but Judith would have been alive at this point. So this would have been something perhaps where memories of a childhood are being sort of intermixed in some ways there. So I think like anyone's memories of childhoods, we don't exactly remember about our childhoods, and we often rely on our parents to tell and retell things to us about our childhood, and then, you know, what gets told as fact is often a sort of compilation of different memories. So in some senses, this is a very roundabout way of saying we don't know a lot about Alfred's childhood.
But now, I guess now might be a really appropriate time actually for me to ask you about the source material that we have briefly before we get onto the meat of his story. What difficulties do you have as a historian with the source material from this time, and how reliable are the bits of information that we have?
Oh gosh, the sort of reliability of the source material is one of those questions that historians of, well, any period obviously have to grapple with, but in this period especially, you've got sources which are being constructed in order to tell a particular agenda. So even something like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which when you look at it is just a list of dates, and you know, in this year Frithroth died or whatever, you know, these particular names of obscure kings. There is no King Frithroth, by the way. I was just sort of, you know, giving by way of example Athelbald or whatever. These dates might be said to be quite unbiased in terms of their presentation, but actually what is selected for recording is the construction of a kind of propaganda machine for the West Saxon court, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle goes through different stages of retelling. So there's a sort of stage up until about the kind of early. Well, there's a stage actually, gosh, this is getting too technical, but there's a stage going up until the late 870s, and then another stage in the 880s, and then one more in the early 890s, where there are different revisions of the Chronicle. And we kind of know about these because there are different manuscripts, and they reflect some of those revisions. But even something that sort of says, in this year this happened, well, actually that selection of dates, and sometimes the actual retelling of what is chosen to be told is in itself kind of an aspect of spinning, really. You know, there's aspects of, well, I hesitate to use the word because it's used so often, but you know, the fake news word is so much there in terms of the construction of it. But that construction itself, I think, is very interesting because it tells us something about the kind of mentality, the mindset of the figures at the court, who are incredibly literate and very intelligent, very articulate in pulling all this material together. So I've given the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle by way of example. I know you've got loads of other questions, but there are lots of other sources as well, lots of other works which are traditionally said to be the translations of Alfred himself. Which is one of the wonderful things about Alfred's reign, is that there are these texts which are sort of classical patristic Christian texts, the sort of works of the great church fathers of the 4th, 5th centuries AD, which are kind of said to be these, you know, the works which are there for Christian learning, and then they're being retold in Old English, which is quite remarkable, really, because from the sort of textual references, actually Latin is thought to be the better language to know, but if you can do it in Old English so that people can understand it, so that the majority of people can understand it, that is, you know, it's a better hit rate, if you like, than hitting a few literally refers to Latin people. But those are thought to be the work of Alfred, but are probably the work of a kind of coterie of scholars are focused around the king, over whom the king has this kind of editorial insight. I think that's the sort of consensus of scholarship. There are people who are far more clever than me who are able to kind of read through the language in the Old English and go, oh yeah, this particular selection of verbs and this particular selection of nouns says something about the editorial mind that's going on at this time or whatever. But we've got this real insight into something really exciting happening at the end of the late 9th century.
That's so interesting, this kind of myth making and propaganda, and as you said, fake news. Let's move on to his reign then. what I would love is if you could briefly describe his coronation, what that would have been like, or crowning, because obviously that happened in Winchester, didn't it? Yes.
Or did it? Did it?
Okay,
It happens in Winchester in the Last Kingdom, and I remember being asked
all right. Well,
about loads of notes for saying about the coronation ceremony for Alfred, and trying to sort of spending a couple of days, it should have been a month, Lavelle, it should have been a month, but it's a kind of couple of days of deep sort of reading of different people, like Ginty Nelson, in fact, reading about the coronation ordinays and sort of swatting up on these different details. And there are a couple of coronation, there's a few actually coronation ordinays, so the orders of coronation service for Anglo-Saxon England going on to the sort of immediate post-Norman conquest period. And the kind of details of these vary in terms of what is said to have happened. So one of the things is it a crown that's placed on the head, or maybe the sort of form of language might be that it's a helmet actually rather than a crown, because our sort of pictorial evidence is in the 10th century. It's for a crown. And maybe that is a sort of new thing in the 10th century. And well, effectively the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tends to use the references in Old English, feng to richa, so succeeds to the kingdom. So Alfred or whoever, or his brother, they've all feng to richa in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it's a reference to their elevation. You've got an acclamation. I think these are the sort of key things, is that you have in the late 9th century you're seeing a kind of anointing of a ruler, and then you've also got an acclamation as well. So that means that in the phrase, in the Latin phrase, it's a variation of omnes gaudeant. So they all praise, basically. So everybody sort of raises their hands and cheers, and that is an essential part of rulership and an essential part of kingship in a king-making ceremony. By the I think it's in the 10th century in England, you've got queen-making ceremonies as well that are going on. The West Saxons tend to sort of push the royal wives to one side and refer to them mainly as merely as king's wives in this period. But there is this kind of element of both the favour of God through the bishop and through the holy oil, the chrism, effectively, which is sort of spread on the body in some way, shape, or form, and then also that kind of moment of the horde of barbarians, effectively a kind of echo of the horde of barbarians raising their spears and shouting for the boss, basically.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. It's interesting what we do know and what we don't know. And I'm very aware of the time issue here, so we're pressed for time, and we need to get on. We need to get on to Alfred's reign.
We're most of the way through, and we're only at the beginning, right?
So, I guess what would be really good is if you could give an overview of, firstly, his achievements and what his legacy has been, but with a particular interest. Well, my particular interest would be in some of the battles and the conflicts that he had with the Viking inhabitants of Britain as well, and particularly the Battle of Edington, if that's possible. And then I'll move on to asking you after that about his legacy a little bit more in depth. So if that's all right with you.
Yeah. I mean, it is the sort of responses to the Vikings, those folk who come along and steal the ball, basically, who tend to sort of elicit the sort of great response of the imagination, because it's a period in the 870s where Alfred is at a battle in, first of all, in 871. It's a year of many battles, shall we say. Asser and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle disagree somewhat in terms of the number of battles which are recorded for 871, actually. But there's a battle in somewhere along the line of the Ashdown Hills in, what was Berkshire, Oxfordshire, Alfred kind of moves from being a prince second in line to the throne to basically being this sort of heroic warrior figure, while according to Asser's account, actually, while his brother is praying in a tent. And this is sort of, I think this is Alfred being set up as taking over in terms of rulership. And his brother died soon afterwards, and quite often I think there's a sort of assumption that it's as a result of wounds sustained during that battle, though it's never explicitly said. And then for the 870s, there's a kind of succession of encounters with the Vikings, some of which actually may well have ended up with a little bit of paying off the Vikings. In 871, there's a payment of Danegeld, and quite often Ethelred the Unready, who's another king who I've looked at, but it sort of attracts far less interest in many ways. Ethelred the Unready gets a very bad press because of the payment of Danegeld to Vikings. Alfred did the same in 871, and you could say, well, Alfred in some ways uses payments of Danegeld to sort of respond to Vikings and sort of sort out the defences and sort out the military. And in a sense, I suppose he does. But actually in 876, he was taken by surprise when the Vikings march across Wessex and end up in Wareham, in Dorset, and there are encounters with Viking attempts are made to make peace again in 876, and they're less successful actually than they had been. So it kind of suggests that the Vikings have got more interest, and yet again peace is made, but it doesn't last, because in 878, in the Winter Festival, when Alfred was at Chippenham, or had been at Chippenham, I suspect he had been at Chippenham, the Vikings seem to have descended. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, actually, I think it says after Twelfth Night rather than at Twelfth Night. So I think the implication is they knew were to come at a point of an important festival within the Christian calendar. And as I'd said earlier, because of course this is a very smoothly well-planned interview here, kings moved around from place to place around their kingdom, and the king was probably at Chippenham, which was a royal estate at that point. And the Vikings didn't play by the proper rules. Winter is not a time for campaigning, conventionally speaking. There are kind of set campaigning times in the early medieval year. The Carolingian Franks gathered their armies in March. The March field was the gathering of the army and the assembly. So that was, you campaign through the spring and the summer, and then you go home again for the winter. The Vikings are cheating. They're setting up encampments at different places in Mercia, Northumbria, and whatever, and then boom, they hit the West Saxon kingdom. So you get this classic moment when a big chunk of the kingdom is taken over by Vikings, possibly including Hampshire and sort of wide areas of Wessex. And Alfred's kingdom is sort of reduced to if we're to take the propaganda at face value, it's reduced to a few square meters at Athelney. It's probably a bit more than Athelney, because I think what Alfred was doing was using Athelney as his base from which to retrieve the feorn, the sort of land and produce, the food that a king needed in order to maintain that they were still king. But effectively, it's a very good story, isn't it? That he's reduced to the few square meters of the Somerset marshes, where of course he's disguised and not recognized, and so as a result of not being recognized, he's given culinary responsibilities to look after the cakes as they're cooking in a kitchen. Dear oh dear, maybe good at some things, but he's not good at cooking.
That's historical fact. Alfred the Great was not a good cook. Okay, so very simple and obvious question, but I'm sure there's a big answer to this. But we do have some questions, I think, to get through. But before we do that, Why has he gone down in history as the Great and not just Alfred?
Well, it's partly a result of Tudor propaganda, because it suited the Tudors to be able to sort of pick up on a particular figure whom to the Tudors represented somebody who wasn't a Roman Catholic, which, if you sort of read the sources properly, I think Alfred was very good towards Rome and made sure he paid his Peter's pence, and was probably one of the great Catholic kings of England. But that aside, there is this sort of element of learning in terms of Alfred's rulership as well, and he's remembered by figures in later generations as well. He's remembered as Alfred the Wise, actually, in there's a couple of charters from I think it's the 10th century, where, well, it must be the 10th century actually, which refer to him as Alfred the Wise. And I think that is an indication about the way in which that idea of a kind of scholarly court is growing up around him. And then you've got other later historians remembering the ways in which there is this kind of program of learning and these scholars, and then things really take off in terms of saying, oh yeah, Alfred is the actual one who's translated these different works. So you've got these things. You've got law codes, which is an influential law code within the so-called doom books of the Anglo-Saxons, and simply I'm in many ways, this is a plug for another book actually. I've got the Alfred's Wars book, which, this is 10 years old now actually, but the Alfred's Wars book came out as a kind of way of thinking about the ways in which military systems which are organized under Alfred's reign have an impact upon later generations. So when there is a kingdom of the English in the 10th century, in many ways it's founded upon some of the systems that have been devised during the later 9th century associated with the kind of military reforms and the administrative mind that Alfred had. I suspect it's a very boring mind in many ways, obsessed with clocks and counting time and measuring things. But that kind of ability to think about measurements then goes on to feed into the ways in which the kingdom is then organized, and it's organized in a sort of military senses, and it's organized in this kind of religious and intellectual sense. So the idea of kingship in many ways is being redefined in the late 9th century. It owes a lot to the Carolingians, and I have to say this is where I do find it funny that Alfred is kind of used as this sort of vision of Englishness, because it owes so much to the kind of European idea of rulership. It's sort of being carried forward into the English royal family. But anyway, that's a sort of additional point there.
It's a huge legacy, and we do see him represented in different ways. And now, a confession, I used to work in television, and after we had the documentary exploring the Richard III's skeleton that was recovered, the next thing on everybody's radar was, where is Alfred actually buried? Could you tell me about what we know about his burial and about his final resting place?
Right. Okay. Yes. The final resting place of Alfred, whether he's under a car park in the suburbs of Winchester, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Actually, if that were the case there. I mean, there was a certain amount of excitement a few years ago when a pelvic bone was carbon dated and thought to be, well, is this from the Anglo-Saxon period? And if so, the position from which it's found might place it close to the high altar, which sort of gives it a possibility. I wondered about is it effectively a 50-50 that it's either Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, who was buried on the other side of the altar, or Alfred, or possibly, I mean, it's going to be somebody high status anyway. It's from the Anglo-Saxon period. You don't bother carrying bones from the new Minster, the great church which was built next to Winchester Cathedral, or built next to the predecessor of Winchester Cathedral, actually. So Newminster was built alongside the predecessor of Winchester Cathedral. Details. And effectively, that church was moved. The Newminster was moved to the northern suburbs of Winchester in Hyde in 1110 at the time of Henry I, and so all the important figures associated with that church are then moved as well in part of a great processional ceremony. So maybe he's one of those figures who, you know, maybe it's not beyond the realms of possibility that famous bone belongs to Alfred. I'm not sure I want to stake my house on it, but I think it's complicated by the fact that the archaeology is very, very complicated for that particular site, because of the various phases of you know, the different buildings that have been that have sort of come up and come down on that particular site. So I think I'll leave that particular one there. Are we starting to move towards audience questions at this point, Rebecca, by the way?
So we have a question, and obviously we started a couple of minutes later, so I think we've probably got about 7 or so minutes left.
Right. Sorry, I mean, it just kind of sounded like it was a question that would come from the audience, actually. There, it kind of wouldn't have surprised me if somebody wanted to ask about that particular question anyway.
We do have a question here, and please do submit your questions if you have them. We have a question here from Harry that says, you like football analogies. The Tudors made him great, and the Victorians endorsed that. In a ranking of monarchs over the years, where does Alfred stand in your view?
Wow, right, okay. So this is does he make it to the Premier League or not in some senses? Yeah, I think he makes it into the Premier League, certainly. Michael Wood, the great historian Michael Wood, emphasizes actually it's Athelstan, who is Alfred's grandson, who is the figure who's able to construct a kingdom of the English, and at points actually it's sort of he's able to express himself as an emperor of Britain as well, is Athelstan. Not that necessarily sort of appearing as an emperor is necessarily, you know, marks of greatness, but it certainly is in terms of medieval rulership, and so in a sense, in terms of the pushing out the extension of the extension of the kingdom, is Athelstan who seems to really be able to sort of push this forward, push that agenda forward. So maybe Athelstan might be sort of managing to just pip that top place. I mean, I'm talking in terms of medieval monarchs, and I'm talking in, you know, my radar is effectively from about the mid 12th century backwards, effectively, and when we sort of say look at if we're to go with the 8th century, for example, you know, my radar, I find the 8th century a sort of very difficult period as well, I have to confess, but I suppose somebody like Offa as well is going to rank pretty highly. So Alfred is fighting hard for a top 4 space in terms of the footballing analogies, but I think he's very clearly within there, and I think it would sort of depend on the you know, on the state of the end of the season, so to speak.
Okay, right. So we've got a couple of more questions, and we'll have to fire through these quite quickly. So I'm going to ask you the 2 questions at the same time. So Harry also asks, where was he crowned then? I think.
Oh God! Right. Okay.
And then the question after that is, how far can we consider Alfred the king of the English, in inverted commas, or even how much can we consider Alfred creating an idea of Englishness?
Right. Okay. So the question about where was he crowned then, I think you just have to sort of accept this is kind of one of those moments where I'm kind of just hedging around it effectively. I can't remember the precise detail. I'm sure it could be looked up on the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography site there. But yeah, what's the sort of notion of something more than a West Saxon kingdom, I think is very interesting, and I didn't really touch on that aspect of things because there are documents which refer to Alfred being a Rex Anglo-Saxonum, and that term, the Anglo-Saxons, king of the Anglo-Saxons, is in contemporary use during Alfred's reign in the late 9th century. And I'm a historian who kind of looks at that use of that title as something which is being used in contemporary terms. I think there's a certain debate as to how far that term angle is actually meaning something within the West Saxon court, because the West Saxons were referred to themselves as Saxons, which I think is kind of interesting. They were one of the Saxon people, but then you've got the term, the reference to the Angles as well, and so the Mercians, for example, were Angles, or that's the reference term, which is where Offa calls himself in the 8th century king of the Angles, and he doesn't mean king of the English, he doesn't mean king of all of the English, he means he's king of those Angle people who are in Mercia. So you've got this really interesting hybridization of these different identities, which is going on. It's a really interesting sort of idea of the construction of something which is more than a single group, which kind of ties in with Alfred's court as somewhere which is a place where talent can come in from other places, where talent can come in from the old Saxons in Germany, it could come in from the Franks in Francia, France, and the Low Countries, and it could come from Ireland, or it could come from Wales in the case of Assa, or it could come from Mercia as well. These are these different these different groups that can come together to sort of make that sense of an identity. It becomes a kind of political identity, which is probably being used to augment Alfred's power. He's not necessarily doing it to be nice and cuddly and inclusive. He's doing it in order to be what will be God König, good king, in the words of Beowulf. A king who's able to amass riches and be a treasure giver to his followers, and those followers can include people from outside. But it's still a very elitist society, in many ways.
So, okay, so we are running out of time now, but I have two questions. If you feel able to give an answer in a sentence each for both of them, then I can ask these questions. So the first one is, and I'll ask them together, are there any references of borderlands/frontiers between Wessex and the Danegeld or Danelaw after the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum? And the second question is, can you talk, in one sentence, about the significance of Danelaw? They're kind of linked, I suppose.
Oh yeah. Danelaw is the word given to the area settled by Vikings in parts of Mercia and Northumbria, and there's a border line which is set out between Alfred and Guthrum, probably in the 880s actually, rather than exactly in 878 after the Battle of Ethandune. And I realised as I just said the Battle of Ethandune, Eddington, I apologise because I didn't say much about that particular battle.
That's okay.
But yes, I mean there's effectively a treaty and coexistence between the Danish settlers in England, and by Danish we mean Viking, not just people from Denmark, and the figures who were effectively subject to the suzerainty, the control of the West Saxon kingdom.
Thank you, Professor Ryan Lavelle. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. We started a bit late, so we finished a little bit later, but I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you attend the rest of the Heritage Open Days in Winchester, and hopefully we'll see you, maybe, fingers crossed, in person next time. Good night.
That would be nice. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for the questions. And thank you, Rebecca, as